Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's just after 7 o'clock in New York, 6 o'clock in Chicago, 4 o'clock on the West Coast of the United States. So let's get started. I've really been looking forward to tonight's program. My name is Jonathan Silver. I'm the Warren R. Stern Senior Fellow of Jewish Civilization at Tikvah and our Chief Programming Officer. Um, Next week, we're going to make available the newest online course from Tikvah Ideas, dedicated to the biblical legacy in Western art. And this course is designed as a masterclass in art history, in the civilizational echoes of the Hebrew Bible, and as an exploration of the nourishing theological roots of Western culture. At Tikva, we've published essays and convened great conversations and offered courses on all sorts of subjects before, from Jewish thought and Jewish text to Zionism and the political and military dilemmas facing modern Israel. We've covered various authors and subjects in Jewish history and Hebrew poetry and literature, but we've never done anything like this. The entire course will be available to everybody on this call and to the general public free of charge on Tuesday, July 30th. The course's instructor and my guest this evening is the Associate Professor of Art History at Stern College and a very dear friend of Tikva, the wonderful Jacob Wisse. You'll soon see Jacob's mind at work and the way he confronts the big questions about Jewish visual culture, the Hebrew Bible's relationship to the physical image, and much else. But I just want to say before we do that, a word about Tikva's interest in investing in the subject and in Jacob's course in particular. See, this moment, as we're speaking right now, Israel's engaged in a war for its very survival on multiple fronts, and the brave women and men of the IDF are engaged in their vigilant defense of the Jewish state. Britain and France, two large and storied Jewish diaspora communities, have just elected governments that raise serious questions for the Jews who live there. And in the United States, we're in the middle of some of the most intense couple of weeks in modern political history. The attempted assassination of a former president, the announcement that the current president will not seek re-election, the catapulting of his vice president into the nomination with just 100 days until the general election. These are times of great and grand political consequence for the West and for us, the Jewish people. So it would be reasonable if you're wondering why Tikva wanted to invest at this moment in an exploration of painting and art history. And I don't want to go on too long, but I want to say a word of apology, of defense. And I think that, well, as I think about it, it begins with the fact that animals do not paint, and animals do not produce sculpture, and animals not only don't do those things, but they don't miss having them. But you see, human beings do. And it's simply a fact laden into the nature of the human condition that our lives are better when we are touched with beauty, and our lives are impoverished when we are surrounded by ugliness. The longing for beauty is a uniquely human thing, no less than our capacity for speech and higher reasoning, no less than our capacity for nostalgia, no less than our capacity for moral judgment. Those faculties belong to us alone, and their exercise is what makes us who we are. The very reality of beauty is something that, of all the animals, only the human animal can see and understand. And like music and poetry, the visual arts have been one of the deepest ways that we express the natural human longing for beauty. Great painting can console us in our sorrow, it can affirm us in our joy, it can provoke us, inspire us, it can summon up reverence, and thereby give us a glimpse of what the human drama looks like from God's point of view. One thing that I learned from Jacob in this course is that the wellspring of the Western aesthetic imagination is very often to be found in the verses and chapters of the Hebrew Bible. Painting is one of the media through which the Hebrew Bible taught Western man to become moral, to become a civilizational being. So that's why it's important to study. And why study it now? Why study it when there's so much disorder in the world? I think we study it now because if we needed to wait for world peace and domestic tranquility, we would be waiting forever. And we can't wait forever. So we might as well take up these great questions while we can. One last thing before Jacob comes on and serves as our guide tonight. I mentioned that this online course is going to be made available to students and viewers all over the world free of charge. But that's due to the generosity of Dr. Sheldon Rubenfeld and his children, Jesse and Sarah, in memory of their beloved wife and mother, Linda Steele Rubenfeld, Zichron Levracha. She herself was a lifelong artist and student, and it's a real honor for us to be able to thank the Rubenfeld family for this support. With that, Jacob, I think I've said why we at Tikvah think it's so important to partner with you and create this course in the Hebrew Bible and Western art. But let me ask you to begin with what this course is really about. Not the why, but the what. What are the big themes that we're going to take up in the course together?
Well, I don't know what else left there is to say, frankly. Um, really, I'm touched by your introduction, by the investment you've put in the subject, and just want to say first, just how much I value Tikvah's not just investment in this subject, but in everything you do, and it's really been a wonderful process working on this class, and I look forward to the conversations that will come out of it with you and with everyone in our audience. So thank you, and I do also want to thank your colleagues at Tikvah, Dan Kagan-Kans and David Kaminsky, who were so instrumental in helping put this together. So it's really been a wonderful process. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah. Um, so I guess maybe I might begin just by shifting a little bit just to say something about how this idea emerged for this class, and it really came from the process of teaching. I've been an art historian my adult life. Love teaching. My field, as we often say in the sort of academic realm, is Western art, specifically Northern European Renaissance art, not specifically Jewish art. And as you mentioned, I'm really blessed to be teaching at Yeshiva University. Most of my teaching is at Stern College for Women. Yeshiva University, perhaps one of the only sane campuses in America these days, and it is for that, among many reasons, that it's a great place to teach. And in teaching art history, there's really been a kind of a remarkable richness in being able to teach general art history, Western art history. And I don't just mean the West, but I mean art history from a kind of general academic intellectual standpoint. And one of the things that has increasingly struck me over, I would say, the past number of years is in teaching, from general surveys to general lectures that are more focused thematically, how many works end up, being projected onto the screen that are based on the Hebrew Bible. And at first, I suppose I thought about this, and I thought perhaps this was a personal bias. I was kind of running the tables, sort of putting my finger on the scale from my own, my personal interests, my background. Perhaps I was doing that also because I teach at YU, and I felt perhaps it would be a way to make the subject a little, connect more to students. But increasingly, I realized that so many of the major achievements, revolutionary achievements, movements, radical artistic statements, major events in art, things that shifted style, aesthetics, the way that artists present and interpret subjects from every age, going back really to late antiquity through early Christian art, Byzantine art, medieval art, Romanesque, Gothic, early Renaissance into the Baroque and early modern period. So many of these key subjects were Hebrew biblical subjects. And it strikes me, and it struck me, that this couldn't be a coincidence. In other words, there are all kinds of reasons why, let's let's say, Christian artists used Hebrew biblical subjects. And I suppose we'll discuss some of these, and these come up frequently in the class. They had their own religious take on the Hebrew Bible, political, all kinds of things. But there is, I think, what emerged is a sense in which artists derived great creative inspiration from the Hebrew Bible and from the very character of the Hebrew Bible. And I wanted to try to figure out or look or analyze how that happened. What is it that is going on? What are they deriving inspiration from? And one of the most interesting things to me as an art historian and as someone interested in the Hebrew Bible is the translation, how that process of translation works from the written text, where, since so many works of art are based on text, how that specific process of translation works when artists are working through themes and subjects of the Hebrew Bible. So to come back to your first question, I would say the central theme of this class is the vibrant and central role of Hebrew scripture in art. And one can call it Western art, but I think really one is talking about the greatest sort of tradition of artistic culture and the very essential role that the Hebrew Bible played in developing, inspiring, and creating a richness in that artistic culture that is unimaginable without it.
So of course the artists who are producing this work, most of them are Christians, and they are producing this very often for Christian patrons. And they are drawing inspiration from a text that in their mind is part of the Christian Bible. So what do the Jews have to do with this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good question, and I suspect, I think perhaps personally that this class will be successful if you get a lot of angry letters. Not that I wish that upon you, but I think that obviously a lot of what Christians have to say is a complete upending of the Jewish Hebrew interpretive tradition. Of course, we deal with that, but I would say that perhaps parallel, and maybe we'll come back to the specific ways that that Christians work over the Hebrew Bible, how they interpret the Hebrew Bible. And I think this is a central question, and I think it's important, first of all, that Jews recognize that for all kinds of reasons, which we can talk about. But from an artistic standpoint, I think there are some central and important ways that Christian artists, even when they are adopting a tortured view of Hebrew biblical tradition, are also understanding something and deriving significant inspiration from the very character of the Hebrew Bible. Its rich psychological depth, its interpretive richness, the fact that the Hebrew Bible comes with all the different layers of commentary around it. So it in itself is a work of commentary, as art is. The way that bold innovations in art were inspired by bold innovations in the radical way that the Hebrew Bible is structured, is written, is conceived. It was a revolutionary, and it is a revolutionary text. And so those innovations are, no more foreign to Jews than innovations in any other, holy text is to one's own adherents, right? That we should be caring about these things because they are about the Hebrew Bible. They are about the way that it was conceived. And I would say on the other side, as to why Jews should care about things that interpret our text, let's call it, in ways that we would not traditionally do. Well, I think there's a value in that, especially since I think it's very much underestimated the role that art has played in pervading and creating deep ideas about Jews, about the Hebrew Bible, that are in our culture. And if we don't recognize that, I think we are in a weaker place. We don't understand how people are actually viewing this text, and I think some of the fundamental stereotypes and deeper anti-Semitic ideas derive in many cases from art. Remember, art, when much of the audiences were illiterate, was a fundamental tool to convey institutional values before people could read. And I think we lose sight of that because art today is a very different endeavor. We don't really look to art to convey kind of the general institutional ideals. We think of art very much as something, I think, it's more done by individuals, by creative individuals who are very much not part of institutions. But that was not the case for most of the last sort of 2,000-year history, sort of dating back to the sort of, let's call it, the late antique period. So I think we see a lot about how Jews and ideas about the Hebrew Bible have entered into society, both in positive and deeply damaging ways, by looking closely at the use of the Hebrew Bible in art.
Jacob, turning to the content matter, which some of the great artists of the Western tradition have taken up. Of course, it's true that Christian artists will have illuminated, will have painted, will have depicted the figure of Jesus many times over. But often they have had to turn allegorically to depictions from the Hebrew Bible to explain the significance of Jesus. And there are so many rich physical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible compared to the New Testament, which is a very interior sort of document that helps probe the soul of man,
Yeah.
but is just manifestly less interested in the physical world, and so does not furnish as rich a physical vocabulary. And so it sort of stands to reason when you think of it that when thinking of things to paint, Christian painters would turn to the part of their tradition, which is the part which is ours, that offers so many physical things to look at and dramatic scenes where actions are taking place.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting just on the point of Jesus's physical being. There is no mention of his physical appearance in the New Testament. Nothing really that you can sort of derive any kind of sense of his physical appearance. And when sort of later Christian theologians are kind of working through some of the ideas of how to form an idea of how he looked, they look to books like Isaiah, texts that in Isaiah one might not think of as the most visually sort of descriptive compared to the narrative richness you get in other sort of texts in the Hebrew scripture. But it is sort of often used as a sort of basis for kind of imagining the sort of identity of Jesus. So everything from the physical appearance of Jesus to the narrative structure, early Christian, the catacombs where most early Christian art appeared, heavily relied on Hebrew biblical themes that would have been very familiar to the audience growing up in that late antique world. So, for instance, in the catacombs, you'll often see images of Jonah being used as a prefiguration of Jesus. Jonah understood differently by early Christian theologians, specifically because when he was swallowed by the great fish and then emerged, they took that as a symbol of resurrection. And this idea was used, especially in the catacombs, where they hoped for the idea of a renewal of the soul in the
Mm.
afterlife based on this idea of a kind of resurrective idea. They often paired this image of Jonah with the image of Jesus as a good shepherd, an image that often appears in early Christian art. So there are countless, examples of this. And I will say, this course does not exhaust them, and it does not provide a comprehensive view of the way that Christians use the Hebrew Bible, and it gets into other themes as well. It's very selective, but I think we try to select themes that provide a range of ways of how the Hebrew Bible inspired artists.
So maybe it makes sense for me to ask you to actually show us a couple of images and sort of just talk us through the sort of things that you like to spotlight in the class.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'll maybe just say first of all, so the way the course is structured is that there are 5 episodes that we look at. We provide a kind of introduction, and these 5 episodes are the binding of Isaac, Jacob wrestling with the angel, Moses presenting the Ten Commandments, the image of Jeremiah, or more specifically Jeremiah lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem, and Esther before Ahasuerus. So they come from different parts of, from Genesis, from Exodus, from the prophets, and from the writings. And I think there's a sort of interesting range of the ways that these subjects come to life. So just the subjects that I thought I would highlight here. I'll share my screen with you. All right, so you can see the images, yeah. So the binding of Isaac, as many people know, is often referred to in Christian art and Christianity as the sacrifice of Isaac, because Isaac is often used as a prefigurative symbol of Jesus. And this is not the invention of artists. One shouldn't get the idea that artists are creating these parallels on their own. These are based on established sort of standard ways that the Hebrew Bible is used, and creates these parallels. And 2 of the works that perhaps any survey class, I'm sure, or I hope a number of people in the audience will recognize these 2 images. You will see in often introduction to art classes, certainly any Renaissance art classes, are these 2 works that played a very fundamental role in really the sort of beginnings of the Renaissance, the early Renaissance in Florence, really birthplace of the Renaissance. This is a place where professional corporations, guilds, would beautify and decorate and manage the operation of buildings, of institutions within the city of Florence. And one of the most important of these buildings was the baptistry, the place where all Florentine citizens were baptized. And right around 1400, when Florence was recovering from having been sort of really struck very harshly by the bubonic plague about sort of half a century before, the city was rebuilding. And one of the most important guilds was the Wool Merchants Guild. Florence was at the time becoming one of the centers of textile sort of finishing and trade. And the wool merchants were in charge of the decoration of the baptistry. And what they did was, in order to create a new set of bronze doors, one of the main entry points into this building, was they did something in a very Renaissance way. They initiated a competition. And this competition called on 7 of the most talented sculptors in the region of Tuscany to create one panel that would be judged and the winner of that competition would be given the honor of making this set of bronze doors. And the subject that these 7 artists were asked to do was the binding or the sacrifice of Isaac. And we're very fortunate to have the 2 panels. On the left of your screen is Lorenzo Ghiberti's panel, and on the right, Filippo Brunelleschi's panel. And these were the 2 that were actually deemed to be the finalists. And there's a very interesting sort of story about how this competition evolved. It's accounted in very different ways. On the one hand, by Ghiberti, who writes his own autobiography and says that basically he was declared the winner without question. Brunelleschi's biographer provides a much more complicated account, probably a little bit more truthful, about how this competition ensued. But I think one of the interesting things about this is, first of all, why the subject of the binding of Isaac, the sacrifice of Isaac, and also how these artists depict this subject. As to why the subject was chosen, we don't have any records, but I think one interesting idea is because the ram is offered as the replacement for Isaac at the center of this story. And both of these artists, among the other artists, featured this ram with its woolly, coat, right? You can see both in Brunelleschi's and in Ghiberti's. This might have actually served as a kind of, product placement. Here we are, the wool merchants. What could be a better object of our sort of commercial enterprise than to have this, this object of what became, the replacement in this dramatic story, serve as the centerpiece. But I think more important, more central was the very dramatic nature of this story. And although in the account in the Hebrew Bible, there isn't much description of Abraham's, sort of inner workings, what he was thinking, the psychology of this. But this became one of the most sort of central fascinations of artists. How do you depict this dramatic event through the inner sort of psychological, tortured psychological landscape of Abraham? Now, what's interesting about these 2 depictions is they depict this in 2 very different ways. And I might just go to a detail here. On the right, you see Brunelleschi depicting this without any hesitation, right? He has Abraham perfectly ready. In fact, it looks like the knife, which seems to be partially hidden by his left hand, is probably already in contact with Isaac's skin, perhaps even close to his neck. And Isaac himself seems to be grimacing, if not, in fact, screaming. And in fact, the angel is physically restraining Abraham from this act. Something, in fact, that the text does not say, right? We read in the text that this is an audible account to Abraham. And I think there's a sense here that Brunelleschi is channeling a kind of interpretive line in Jewish tradition, that Abraham deeply understood this command and he was willing to do it with no hesitation. This is a line that Rashi takes up based on early Midrashic tradition. Ghiberti on the left adopts a completely different, a radically different view. First, you have this sort of dynamic movement of the angel that's coming in, or the messenger of God, to stop Abraham, but has not physically restrained Abraham. Abraham, meanwhile, is sort of directing the knife towards Isaac, but is also turning away, kind of in this parabolic curve, away from his son. This seems to be an image of deep ambivalence. This is not a man who seems to want to commit this act. And Isaac, meanwhile, is both sort of, looking in somewhat terrified fashion at his father, but also sort of following his lead. And so I think this work is very much about the inescapable, for at least Renaissance and later modern viewers the inescapable psychological drama of this story. This is not something that earlier texts really delved that much into. And this became very much the central way that artists from the Renaissance through the Baroque undertook to make this subject. In fact, psychological, the horror of this event was imagined in all kinds of ways by artists up through the late Renaissance into the Baroque period, when I'm sure many people are familiar with images by Rembrandt, Rubens, Caravaggio. And I think there is something about this subject, the very subject and the richness of the story, that inspired artists to really use psychological richness in art as a kind of tool. So you have these two fundamentally different ways. Both of them touch on different aspects of Jewish interpretive tradition.
And the idea is that if one wanted to find some material or physical vocabulary, some visual vocabulary to express devotion, sacrifice, these larger theological ideas, this is the scene that one might reach for, because the sort of tableau of the scene allows one to, by commenting on it and emphasizing this or that interpretive tradition that emerged from it, one could thereby explore those very themes. There are few others. There are few others as adept as this one.
Absolutely. And they all really possess their own kind of interpretive traditions, as you mentioned, and it's why I focus on the episodes distinctly, because I think there is an interesting way, even though we don't imagine that Brunelleschi and Ghiberti were reading Rashi or had direct access to, Midrashic commentary. I think it is a fascinating idea that there are direct relationships between sort of these long lines of sort of Midrashic interpretation and the way that artists interpreted them. I think that, gives one a sense of the very breadth of these interpretations, how widely they were understood, even if they were not directly accessed. In other episodes, like Queen Esther before King Ahasuerus, there is also a lot of creative invention. And this is something that people familiar with art will recognize. Artists rarely illustrate subjects. They rarely take subjects and illustrate exactly how it is written in a text. That is not what artists do. Artists are interpreters. And I think that is another aspect of what you'll discover in this class is the process of interpretation, how subjects can be used to spark other ideas that might be used for other purposes. And this subject in particular was of enormous interest to artists from the late Renaissance through the Baroque period. The point really halfway through Megillat Esther, which is often really seen as a turning point when Esther appears uninvited before Ahasuerus, and Midrashic interpretation and Greek and later the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible creates this elaborate idea that this was so terrifying that Esther really nearly fainted. She was kind of in a process of swooning. There was such terror because there was the threat that she would be killed by appearing uninvited before the king. Well, artists take this and turn it into a kind of even more dramatic presentation. Here you have in one of the great Venetian late Renaissance, early Baroque artist Tintoretto. He's made of Esther. Not only is she sort of swooning, but she's out cold. She's fainted completely. And the likely reason for this is that they saw Esther as a model for the Virgin Mary. A kind of strange comparison, you might say, but they saw them both as brave intercessors on behalf of their people. And there is a tradition that emerged significantly in the late medieval and early Renaissance, especially in works of art, that showed at the moment of the crucifixion, or the moment when Jesus is being brought to the cross, that Mary was either swooning or that she completely faints. And this is intended to reveal not only the kind of human sense that she is, such a devoted, loving mother and so distraught at this, but also theologically, Christians understood this to emphasize her role as co-redemptrix, that she was like Jesus, sort of almost participating in the process of death. And it was at this time that artists like Tintoretto, and this is one of the earliest works that, in a sense, kind of imposes or creates of the figure of Esther this movement that, while it also, I think, reveals the sort of theatricality of the Purim story that we get from the book of Esther, there is a sense where you have this character in this book, but it is also used specifically for the sake of underlying the relationship between a Hebrew biblical and a Christian theme. And I will just say one particular thing about this subject. You mentioned before aspects about Christian, use of Hebrew biblical themes that are run counter to the meaning of the Hebrew Bible. Well, this is one of the most dramatic examples of that in other uses of this subject. One slightly later, for instance, that we discuss in the series, the subject of Esther appearing before Ahasuerus is used as an argument for converting Jews to Christianity. So think about the kind of mind-boggling overturning of the meaning of Megillat Esther, a theme book, of course, about the heroism of Esther helping to protect the people, her people, from destruction, and it is in fact used in the opposite way. So there are, of course, ways that subjects like this can sometimes literally be turned on their heads.
Jacob, I don't know if because I really don't know the history of art, but one of the things that you spoke about is how innovations in technique and style are also bound up in this image. And looking carefully, I want to just offer an observation and ask you to comment. But you see all kinds of the human figures in this painting are bending over, and there's some are going this way and some are going that way. But of course, Esther is falling backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it looks to me like the only person whose entire body is oriented differently than everyone else. At some point, that was like the development of that capability was a new thing under the sun.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are a lot of rich sort of stylistic technical innovations. Tintoretto, he was known for this very dramatic style, a sense of movement, a sense of rich color, which you can see. The brushwork is a little hard to see in reproduction. He was nicknamed, in fact, Il Furioso, or the Furious One, which in part probably had to do with the very nature of this dynamic style. And I think it is absolutely true that subjects that come from the Hebrew Bible often were used because they are so dramatic. And I would just suggest that anyone, if you read, the Hebrew Bible, any of the, sort of narrative passages from the, from the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses, next to, passages from the New Testament, and you will understand why these themes could be so inspiring. So I would say to this point, even when subjects are being used in a, let's just say, thematically tortured way to sort of overturn some basic sort of narrative message that comes from the Hebrew text and used to very different effects, I think you do get a real sense of understanding and appreciation for the very dynamic character of the Hebrew Bible.
Well,
And then I just,
ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite you to ask some of your questions too. Jacob, maybe you can show us one or two additional images.
yeah, I'll just,
Um,
I'll just,
and in the meantime, if you have
yeah,
questions, please type them into the Q&A function in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, and soon we'll be able to come to your questions.
yeah.
But Jacob, tell us about this one.
Yeah, so quickly, I did want to show at least one image from the modern period. This is a work, an artist, I'm sure many people are familiar with, Paul Gauguin, who began really as an impressionist, painting very much in the impressionist style in Paris. Even by in the early 1880s, he was still making works that would be very familiar to anyone who is, familiar with impressionist work. Well, when he by the time he moved to a community in northern France, in Brittany, in Pont-Aven, he was interested really in a very different style. And this work was fundamental really in expressing his interest in moving from a style, one can call it more observational, in other words, an impressionism where you are really looking at the natural world to really inspire how you are painting, how you are sort of creating subjects. And he became really one of the initiators of what we call the symbolist style, a style that where one is using, even when one is painting things that emerge from nature, one is using a dramatically creative sense of color, of proportion. Objects that are seen in these works are not meant to be direct relationships to their sort of mirrors in the natural world. And one of the inspiring subjects for him is this subject of Jacob wrestling with the angel, a subject that has a kind of remarkably rich legacy in Western art, even through the modern period. We often don't think of modern artists, 19th century artists, as interested in religious subjects. But in fact, a number of 19th century artists, and especially in the symbolist movement, were interested in this. And he wrote about this painting to Vincent van Gogh, with whom he corresponded. And he wrote that this was not a description or an image of Jacob wrestling with the angel, but a vision that took place actually in the imagination of the people who are seeing this scene. And in fact, this is based on the idea that these women from Brittany, these Breton women, have listened to a sermon. And you could see the priest here, this tonsured priest, often thought to have been based partially, at least, as a self-portrait on Gauguin. He has delivered this sermon, and the women who have heard this sermon about Jacob, the episode of Jacob wrestling with the angel, are imagining this scene taking place in the upper right quadrant of the painting. And Gauguin writes that this is meant to be something that is taking place absolutely within the imaginative, visionary world. And it strikes me, when you read that passage, it sounds very much like the description of the Rambam, of how Maimonides describes the scene of Jacob wrestling with the angel and other such scenes. He writes in general that whenever you see an angel like this appear battling in this way, this is visionary. This is absolutely visionary in character. And I think so what you have here is a kind of remarkable example where the very nature of this subject, the subject of Jacob wrestling with this figure that is, prompts a lot of questions in Jewish interpretive tradition. What is this figure? And the Rambam certainly interprets it or expresses this idea of its visionary character. And I think you can see this very close relationship between, one of the great sort of Jewish thinkers 700 years before, how it relates in some remarkable way to the inspiration that it had on this artist who was trying to innovate, and I think was inspired by this subject to create a kind of remarkably dramatic, bold statement of artistic creative innovation.
So this is very important because in formulating your contention, your interpretation that way, Jacob, you make clear to us that the main argument here is not that all of these Christian artists are studying Rambam or studying Rashi.
Yeah,
The argument instead is that there are echoes and parallels in recognizing different stylistic and interpretive traditions that converge on shared understandings.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, questions like that, often appear. There are many discussions around, how did Rembrandt access commentaries? We have some evidence that other artists did. Most of these artists, as you mentioned before, were not reading the original Hebrew. They were often reading sort of apocryphal versions of the text, as is the case in the story of Esther before Ahasuerus, which is based on an apocryphal account. But there is something both sort of deeply, I would say, intuitive about the way that the very core themes of this subject, and if you think about this subject in some sense as about the meeting between the material and the immaterial worlds, something where Jacob, as this physical being, is encountering this messenger of God, or however one interprets this angel, this man, although it's described as an ish, as a man in the text. This is something that is the very thing that artists do. They paint, they sculpt in physical form, but they are trying to create something in the conceptual abstract universe. And I would suggest, absolutely, Gauguin, I am not suggesting here, was accessing some sort of lost version of the Rambam that appeared on his shelf. Rather, I think there is a deep appreciation for and understanding for some of the key themes that, of course, Jewish interpretive tradition was sensitive to, and that artists are reacting to.
So just as a spoiler alert, do you take up the work of Rembrandt in this course?
I do.
Okay.
I felt a little bit, like I was treading on, a figure in the Tikvah universe, on his coattails. But I tried to, say a few things maybe that our friend Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik has not said. And yeah, you'll see images by Rembrandt. You will also see Jewish images done in synagogues and in other Jewish contexts. So I don't want to suggest that this is completely absent of art that was actually done within a Jewish context. But I think it was important, if one is interested in art, and if was interested in the greatest sort of artistic tradition, one has to contend with Christian art. And I think by seeing the rich ways that artists understood and were inspired by, and appreciated the core values of the Hebrew Bible, I think it is something that people will expand their appreciation for our beloved holy text.
That might be a good occasion to turn to some of the questions that are coming in from our viewers, Jacob. There are a number of questions about Jewish art. But I want to come to that in a minute. I'd like to give the honor of the first question to our friend Sheldon, who asks this. The Hebrew Bible cannot be seen while the Christian God can be seen. How did these facts influence Jewish and non-Jewish artists?
Yeah, it's such a wonderful question, and well, in fact, what I deal with in a number of the episodes are scenes that come from late antique Jewish art, and a couple of the synagogues that we touch on. Dura Europos, a synagogue that began as a kind of domestic sanctuary and was expanded probably in the middle of the 3rd century. Beit Alpha in the Galilee and in Israel. And both of those are cases where in scenes like the binding of Isaac, but other scenes as well, scenes of Moshe, a number of scenes of Moses that is depicted in Dura Europos. The hand of God actually is depicted. The hand of God appears probably at least 10 or so times in Dura Europos. And
Meaning by Jewish artists in a Jewish worship space.
exactly. And I think this is, this is a larger topic, and I don't think we'll have the time here to go into it. But I will just say that I think one thing that we do, that I try to touch on in the series is that there was a rich visual tradition of Jewish art in this period. They had a very different way of presenting images of the divine. That is in an abbreviated form, in a way that was understood as absolutely not Christian and not pagan, but distinctly Jewish. I think over the course of the past 1500, sort of millennium and a half or more, the idea of what is appropriate has changed dramatically in Jewish art, and I think so that's an interesting question in itself. But as to the sort of larger, the question, I think there are ways that Jewish artists, everyone up to Chagall, they depicted imagery that absolutely channels sort of divine themes, even if there is not an anthropomorphic, traditional Christianized version of the divine. And I think this is something that I think we often lose sight of, is that even though we may not have an easily sort of represented visual of God, there are kind of many ways that I think the power of what one associates with the divine can be represented, and that are represented, or at least attempted to be represented, by artists.
Okay, so we have already stipulated that that the main contention of the course is not that all these important innovators and masters of Western painting are like studying rabbinic literature at night. Okay, that is not the main contention of the course. Nevertheless, one of the interesting questions to me, at least here, asks whether there are any examples of depictions of art drawn from the stories of the Hebrew Bible that do evince some kind of evidence, that do evince some kind of knowledge on the part of the artist of a specifically rabbinic or Jewish understanding.
Yeah, so I think probably the best example is Rembrandt. I deal with the scene of Rembrandt's remarkable scene of Jacob wrestling with the angel, the scene of Moses and the Ten Commandments. And I think there are good reasons to believe that he had access, and we know, in fact, he was in touch, with one particular rabbi, but probably other people in the community. And I think that is evident. I think you do see ways that Rembrandt's images evoke, perhaps an even sort of more deeply multi-layered or richer understanding of different aspects of rabbinic and interpretive tradition. But I will also say that that one also has to recognize that Rembrandt was, working in a Protestant society, and a lot of that can also relate to the ways that Protestants, deeply, imbued with a sense of the Hebrew Bible, were using that within their own culture as well. So I would say that it's a fascinating question, but maybe not for the sake of it being an end result, but how it is used. And Rembrandt, I would say, is one of the artists who is I think very much, aware of certain aspects of rabbinic interpretive tradition.
So look, I just can't resist asking this question. We have seen little samplings of the way that that you treat the interpretive tradition of the binding of Isaac, of Esther, of Jacob, but one of the most often and interestingly depicted figures from the Hebrew Bible in the tradition of Western art, of course, is David. And one of the questions here has to do with David. Um, I would just have to say to the person who's asking this question, you have to register for the course to get the full treatment. But Jacob, can you give us any sample, any little teaser of the ways in which David is deployed? I know that one of the interesting things that one could analyze is the political deployment of David as a
Yeah,
symbol.
yeah, absolutely. So we were talking about the role that Esther emerges as a very powerful symbol of liberation for communities in Venice and other communities. But David, even earlier, became a profoundly important symbol for Florence. Florence considered itself a kind of New Jerusalem. In fact, they based their cathedral in part on the dimensions of Solomon's temple. And perhaps the most famous example of Michelangelo's David, which, although now people see it in the academia, the museum around which really that sculpture, that 17-foot high sculpture stands, originally, after it was moved from the Cathedral of Florence, it stood in front of what was then effectively the town hall. And it stood really as a symbol of their underdog status, because they were at that time battling Milan under the Duke of Milan, who threatened their very safety. And they saw David really as a symbol of their destiny to overcome more powerful enemies. In political terms, I would say these are deep, rich tributes to the kind of sense of not just the heroism and sort of political might eventually of David and people like Esther, who navigated this difficult political situation, but also the idea of a kind of divine sense that they will emerge victorious, that they will be watched over. So David is, in that sense, frequently used. One of the most fascinating things about David also, though, is the various ways he's used, not just in images of David and Goliath, because Michelangelo's David is based on that subject, but there are a number of scenes of a repentant David. A beautiful etching by Rembrandt of David kneeling at his bedside, praying for forgiveness. An image, of course, that imbues our own liturgy. We have this image in the Tachanun prayer, and David is also used as an image of the psalmist. He is a multifaceted figure. Perhaps if there's interest, we'll be able to release some other episodes, and I'd be
A
happy to
sequel.
delve more deeply into the figure of David.
Here's a very interesting question. Can one see echoes of biblical images in Muslim Islamic art the same way that one sees them in Christian
Yeah,
art?
yeah, absolutely. And perhaps this is I would say it was not a choice that I don't really deal with Islamic art in this series. I think it is a reflection really of just how rich the material was that we're dealing with in Jewish and Christian contexts, that that I wanted to do as much justice to the material. But absolutely, one of the subjects, in fact, that I would love to sort of delve more deeply into at some point is the subject of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And this is
Mm.
particularly a subject that Islamic art had an interest in. They call the figures by different names, but Joseph is a figure that is particularly admired in Muslim culture, and so there are a number of scenes like this. Details and figures are changed, and in fact, because of that, what I think in delving into those versions, you would have to treat all kinds of other different sort of interpretive traditions. But absolutely, there are sort of rich ways that Islamic artists use Hebrew biblical subjects, Moses, Abraham as well.
Okay, so my friends, ladies and gentlemen, our hour has come to an end. There are several questions here about the some of the technical matters related to this course and how you can register. Number one, just to repeat, the course is free of charge. You can register at tikvahfund.org/Bible and art. tikvahfund.org/Bible and art. And as for the question when the course is taking place, and if recordings are available if you miss them, actually we're releasing all of the recordings on Tuesday. So you'll be able to watch them as many times as you like at your own pace, at your own schedule. And they'll all be available for you on Tuesday. If you register now, you'll just get an email on Tuesday when the course is live. But that website once again is tikvahfund.org/Bible and art. Jacob Weiss, thank you for being our teacher and for
Thank
joining us.
you. Thank you so much. It's been really just such a pleasure speaking with you and working with you on this project. It's really been a joy.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, with that, we adjourn.